Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is the fall of France in 1940. At the beginning of World War II, France was still a world power. Between the two world wars, many people believed that France had the best army in the world. Winston Churchill thought so. On March 23, 1933, while speaking to the House of Commons, he explained that the new Nazi regime in Germany threatened the peace of Europe. And Churchill said, "There are a good many people who have said to themselves, as I have been saying for several years, thank God for the French army." 1 month later, Churchill stated, "France is not only the sole great surviving democracy in Europe, she is also the strongest military power, I am glad to say, and she is the head of a system of states and nations." So how was France conquered in a matter of only 6 weeks in May and June of 1940? It's not like they were overwhelmed by superior forces. The number of Allied divisions and German divisions were somewhat close to equal. A lot of people, especially Americans, like to make fun of the French in 1940 as incompetent or having no backbone. Such portrayals are very unfair. It's easy for Americans and the British to feel smug because of water. It's nice being an island. That's why the British brag about not being successfully invaded in 1,000 years since the Norman conquest of 1066. And as I say this, I can hear all the Dutch screaming at me saying, "Hey, we invaded Great Britain twice since 1066. The first occurred in June 1667 during the Second Anglo-Dutch War. This incident is known as the Raid on Medway. The Dutch Navy destroyed many English ships at anchor in England. The other invasion of Great Britain, claimed by the Dutch, is what the British call the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The short version is that the British were not crazy about their king, known as James II in England and James VII in Scotland, because he was Catholic. Because of the religious issue, a lot of people in Britain wanted to overthrow King James. So they invited William of Orange of the Netherlands, later known as William III, to be king because he was Protestant and happened to be married to James's Protestant daughter, Mary. The reason why the Dutch claimed this as a successful invasion of Britain is that even though he had been invited by some people in Britain, William was not sure how he would be received. So he showed up in England with an army of approximately 15,000 soldiers and a navy which supposedly had more ships than the famous Spanish Armada of 1588, 100 years earlier. James fled to France, and William and Mary became joint constitutional monarchs of England, Scotland, and Ireland, although the Irish really had no say in the matter. William and Mary were, and are, the only co-monarchs in British history. By the way, that is the origin of the name of that university in Virginia, William and Mary. That is the second oldest college or university in the U.S. after Harvard. It is named William and Mary because the co-monarchs signed the charter for the school to be established. Speaking of names, I have to go off on a little tangent here about the name of the Netherlands. Up until the 1970s, Americans and the British referred to that country as Holland. In that old Beatles song, The Ballad of John and Yoko, John Lennon starts the song, "Standing on a dock at Southampton, trying to get to Holland or France." So why did the Americans and the British call the country Holland? During the Napoleonic Wars, the French conquered the Low Countries. In 1806, Napoleon named the area the Kingdom of Holland, with Napoleon's brother Louis as king. After Napoleon was gone, the country became the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Holland was a province within the Netherlands. That province was later divided into North Holland and South Holland, and there are 10 other provinces in the Netherlands. But the collective region known as Holland has been and continues to be the most populated area. The three biggest and most visited cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague are all in Holland, either north or south. In the 20th century, the Dutch government referred to their country as Holland to appeal to tourists. The official Dutch tourism website is still, as of June 2025, Holland.com. It's not Netherlands.com. The country's logo was an orange tulip with the name Holland across it. But several years ago, they changed that logo to an orange tulip with the letters NL for Netherlands. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, the English-speaking countries finally caught on and started calling the country by its correct name of the Netherlands. Okay, getting back to today's topic. I was pointing out how the British are lucky when it comes to invasions because they live on an island. And for the U.S., the advantage is even greater. We're on a separate continent, separated by vast oceans from any potential enemies. And we're fortunate to have two very nice and friendly neighbors in Canada and Mexico. It's really bad when Americans make fun of France collapsing in only 6 weeks in World War II. The U.S. was completely unprepared for Pearl Harbor, and we got our butts kicked. And if the Japanese or the Nazis were able to invade the mainland of the U.S. in 1941, the American army was not prepared to stop them. But those two oceans gave us plenty of time to build an entire military to take on the Axis powers. It's time to set the scene for the lead up to spring of 1940. The government in France at that time was called the Third Republic. France is currently governed by the Fifth Republic. The French governments are referred to as the Third, Fourth, Fifth Republics because they were based upon different constitutions with different political systems. The Third Republic was proclaimed on September 4, 1870, after the fall of Napoleon III as Emperor of France. He was the nephew of the Napoleon. This was during the Franco-Prussian War. Up until that time, Germany was a bunch of separate states which all spoke German and had a shared culture. The dominant state was Prussia, with its capital Berlin. After defeating France in the Franco-Prussian War, Otto von Bismarck declared the formation of the German Empire on January 18, 1871. And where did the Germans declare their new country? In the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. That is certainly one way to stick it to your enemy. In the early 20th century, France and Germany were on opposite sides in World War I. The Central Powers were mainly Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. They were facing the Allies, mainly consisting of France, Britain, Russia, Italy, and eventually the United States. Russia dropped out of the war because of the communist takeover, and the Germans signed the formal agreement ending the war with the Western Allies, known as the Treaty of Versailles, on June 28, 1919. Although they were on the winning side, the French suffered greatly in World War I. Most of the fighting on the Western Front was done in France, and it devastated that part of the country. According to the U.S. Library of Congress, the French suffered 1.385 million dead and 2.675 million wounded in the Great War. The approximately 4 million casualties represented roughly 10% of the French population at the start of World War I. After World War I, France was the greatest power on continental Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was split into several smaller countries. Russia was becoming the Soviet Union and was in turmoil as a result of the Revolution and Civil War. Germany lost some territory and was stripped of most of its military. France only had one rival for supremacy in Europe, and that was the United Kingdom, but those two countries were allies. At the time, the British Empire was the largest in the world, but France had the second largest empire in the world. But this situation did not last. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. In violation of the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazis began a massive rearmament program. By the summer of 1939, Germany had annexed Austria and essentially Czechoslovakia, and Hitler had his eyes on Poland next. The British and French announced to the world that they would guarantee Poland's independence and would go to war with Germany if the Nazis invaded Poland. On August 23, 1939, the Germans and signed a treaty known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Those were the names of the foreign ministers from the Soviet Union and Germany. This was supposedly a non-aggression pact, but it was also a deal between Hitler and Joseph Stalin to divide Poland between them. On September 1, 1939, the Germans launched Case White, the invasion of Poland. The Germans named their invasion plans Case and then a color. Case White was the invasion of Poland, Case Green was the proposed invasion of Czechoslovakia, and Case Yellow was the invasion of France that we'll talk about later on. On September 3, 1939, Britain and France both declared war on Germany. Now here's where they really missed a golden opportunity. Almost the entire German army, known as the Wehrmacht, and the German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe, were fighting in Poland. There were very few German troops on their western border to defend against any invasion from France. On September 7, 1939, only 4 days after they declared war on the Nazis, the French invaded Germany in what has become known as the Saar Offensive. The French and the British knew that they could not get troops to Poland to help defend their ally. But the thought was that an invasion into Germany could take some of the pressure off of the Poles. This ended up being a very half-hearted offensive. The French did not get very far into Germany. By early October 1939, Poland was conquered and occupied between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. With the collapse of Poland, the French decided to withdraw from Germany in mid-October. This was a missed opportunity. With almost all of the German military in Poland, the French could have driven far into Germany and maybe conquered them. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, German General Alfred Jodl said, "If we did not collapse already in the year 1939, that was due only to the fact that during the Polish campaign, the approximately 110 French and British divisions in the West were held completely inactive against the 23 German divisions." German General Siegfried Westphal was even more blunt. He stated that if the French had attacked in full force in September 1939, the German army could only have held out for 1 or 2 weeks. It's no surprise that the Saar offensive failed. The French had a very defensive mindset between the two world wars. A lot of historians say that the French were fighting the last war. In World War I, all of the advantage was on the defensive side. The development of very sophisticated machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire meant that troops who were in trenches could hold off superior numbers of attacking soldiers. But by the late 1930s, modern tanks and aircraft gave the advantage to the attacking force. As I will explain later, the French felt that they had to be on the defensive because they could not compete with the size and strength of Germany. This defensive mindset led the French to the development of the Maginot Line. First, I'll explain to you what it was, and then I'll explain to you why I think it unfairly gets a bad rap. Let's start with a little geography. France and Germany share a border which is approximately 260 miles or 418 kilometers. That is along the eastern part of France. If you look at a map, south of that common border with Germany, France abuts Switzerland and Italy. And to the north of that border with Germany, France shares a boundary with Luxembourg and Belgium. Between the late 1920s and 1940, the French built a line of fortifications from the English Channel all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. There's an argument as to whether all of France's eastern border was considered the Maginot Line. But usually, when people refer to the Maginot Line, they mean just a portion of the defenses along the border between France and Germany. So when I talk about the Maginot Line, that's what I'm discussing. The defensive network along the French-German border, which was an engineering marvel. The Maginot Line was composed of a series of concrete and armored bunkers. These forts were connected by an underground railroad and were constantly garrisoned by troops. Artillery pieces and machine guns could be raised to fire upon attacking forces from Germany. The jokes about the Maginot Line depict the French as being surprised that the Germans could simply go around it. That's not fair or accurate. The Maginot Line did what it was designed to do. It prevented the Germans from invading France the short way through the common French-German border. And by forcing the Germans to go around the Maginot Line to the north, the French were greatly reducing the areas they would have to defend with their mobile armed forces. That was the point of the Maginot Line. It is much easier to resist an invading army when you have a smaller area to defend. The French did have defenses along their borders with Italy, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. It's just that these defenses were not nearly as strong. All countries have limited resources. Now it's time to talk a little bit more about geography. When you look at a map of Germany, the western border starts at the North Sea with the Netherlands. A little further south, Germany borders Belgium and then Luxembourg. Only after these three nations, commonly called the Low Countries, does Germany share a border with their traditional enemy, France. And in case you're wondering, they're called the Low Countries because large areas of these three nations are at or below sea level. Let's start with Luxembourg. It is bordered by Germany to the east, France to the south, and Belgium to the west and north. It's around 1,000 square miles or 2,600 square kilometers. To put that into perspective for my fellow Americans, it's smaller than the state of Rhode Island. The current population of Luxembourg is less than 700,000 people. In 1940, the population was approximately 300,000 people. The point of all this is that Luxembourg was not going to be able to contribute to a defense against Nazi Germany, but Belgium and the Netherlands could. In this episode, I'm not going to give you too many statistics because so many sources list different numbers for casualties, numbers of divisions, numbers of tanks, planes, etc. So, if any of the military statistics I provide are different than numbers you have seen or read, that's the reason. I'm just providing these figures to give you a general picture of the opposing forces. Divisions were how military leaders in World War II measured the strength of a particular force. Although the number of men in a division varied greatly between armies and sometimes between divisions in the same army. Most of the forces opposing the Germans along the Western Front in the spring of 1940 were supplied by France. The French had 117 divisions. The British Expeditionary Force had 10 divisions in France in the spring of 1940. I had difficulty finding the military strength of the Netherlands, but I believe in 1940 the Dutch had only 8 or 9 infantry divisions with a small number of light tanks. Belgium contributed 22 divisions. So, you can see that the British and French were not just being altruistic in including the Low Countries in a common defense, they certainly wanted the addition of the Dutch and Belgian troops and armaments in defending against the Nazis. The French wanted to build fortifications along the border between Belgium and Germany, since most military leaders believed that the Germans would invade through Belgium. They weren't sure if the Germans would also invade the Netherlands. They didn't do so in World War I. Even though these countries were sticking together, they did have to look out for their own interests. For the French, it would certainly be better if the war was taking place in Belgium instead of France. From the Belgian perspective, if they allowed the French troops into Belgium along the German border, it would really seem like they were making Belgium a target for the Germans. In 1920, shortly after World War I, Belgium signed a military agreement with France. But after a few years of the Nazi regime, the Belgians grew very worried about another German invasion. On March 7, 1936, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, German troops occupied the Rhineland. This was part of Germany on the west side of the Rhine River, which bordered Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. With German troops now along their border, the Belgians abandoned their military pact with France and declared neutrality in October 1936. This meant that the French could not have troops in Belgium or build fortifications along the Belgian-German border. Because of this situation, the British and French developed a plan to have their troops ready along the French-Belgian border. If and when the Germans invaded Belgium on the way to France, the British and French armies would quickly move into Belgium to confront the German army. Because of the strength of the Maginot Line, the French presumed that the Germans would try to invade France through the Low Countries like they had done in World War I. And that is what the Germans were planning throughout the fall of 1939 and into the beginning of 1940, invade France through the Low Countries. But then a crazy thing happened. It's known among historians as the Mechelin incident because of the location where it occurred. So let's set the scene. This was during the time known as the Phony War. It was called the Phony War because Poland was already defeated, and technically Britain and France were at war with Germany, but not much was happening, at least not on land. At sea, a lot was going on in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Allies were waiting for the German invasion of the West. On January 10, 1940, Major Erich Hohenmanns was piloting a German military plane when he got lost in a heavy fog. You have to remember that planes did not have the sophisticated equipment like they do today. Besides getting lost, Major Hohenmanns apparently cut off fuel to the engine by mistake. He was forced to attempt a crash landing in a nearby field. He and his passengers survived the crash, but they were surprised to find out that they had landed in Belgium and not Germany. The passenger, Major Helmuth Reinberger, was carrying documents outlining the German war plans for invading France through the Low Countries. Although there were some comical attempts to burn the documents, the two Germans were captured by the Belgians, and the Western Allies now had documents outlining the German invasion plans. The Germans were concerned that the French, British, Belgians, and Dutch now knew exactly what the Wehrmacht was planning to do. Some in the German command thought that they should just go forward with their original plan called Case Yellow, but Hitler was having second thoughts. Now was the chance for a German general named Erich von Manstein. He had previously proposed a different attack on France, but had been overruled by the German High Command. Now Hitler listened to Manstein and agreed to the Manstein plan. The Allies had approximately 144 divisions, and the Germans had approximately 141 divisions along the Western Front in May 1940. Those numbers don't exactly match the numbers I gave you earlier by country because of differing sources and maybe because certain divisions were not located along the front. Again, if there's any discrepancy in those figures, it really doesn't matter. The point is that the opposing sides were about the same strength. The German army was divided up into three groups. In the south, Army Group C faced the Maginot Line. That was to make the Western Allies think that maybe the Germans would attack there. In the north, Army Group B would attack through the Low Countries, as most people expected. But in the center was Army Group A with most of the German tanks. This is how the Germans defeated the French and British, along with the Dutch and Belgians, in only 6 weeks. And yes, I'm aware that the British did not surrender. Fortunately for the world, Winston Churchill refused to negotiate with Hitler and kept up the fight. I'm just pointing out that the British Expeditionary Force was fighting with the French army in 1940 when they were routed by the Nazis. If the opposing sides had approximately the same number of soldiers, why were the Germans so successful? Two main reasons: tactics and battle plans. Let's discuss tactics first. I'm mostly just going to focus on the French army because the British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian army, and the Dutch army were all small compared to the French troops. The French did not understand how to use armor and airplanes, but the Germans did. Let's discuss tanks first. Supposedly, the German tanks were outnumbered, but they were used much more effectively. The problem was that the French tanks were not concentrated. They were dispersed throughout the infantry as support for the foot soldiers. Heinz Guderian, a German tank commander, was one of the first people to understand that the most effective way to use tanks was to have them combined in their own units. The Germans had panzer divisions. This meant units made up of tanks. Panzer simply means a German armored vehicle, usually a tank. In 1937, Guderian published a book titled Achtung Panzer. That translates literally to attention, tank, but I think it's more of an idiomatic expression and would translate better to beware the tank. Guderian was advocating a new use of tanks with close infantry and air support. Panzer divisions were used to spearhead an attack. They could move more quickly than infantry or heavy artillery, and they could outflank the enemy or get into the enemy's rear. Now let's talk about airplanes. The planes that were used in World War I were very primitive. That's not surprising considering World War I began less than 11 years after the Wright brothers' first successful powered flight on December 17, 1903 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So by the time World War I rolled around, planes had not developed that much. They were mostly used for reconnaissance. Airplanes could fly over enemy lines and report the disposition of enemy troops. There were some very limited uses of planes to drop bombs on the enemy. By World War II, there were sophisticated bombers. Both sides had realized the advantages of level flying bombers. This meant a plane which flew over the enemy and dropped explosives and kept going. Dive bombers, launched from aircraft carriers, were one of the biggest components of sea battles in World War II. The Germans realized how effective dive bombers could be on land. The Stuka dive bomber could deliver an explosive with a fair degree of accuracy. The Stuka could hit targets like enemy tanks or a dug-in position or a building because it dove directly at its target before releasing the bomb. If you have seen any World War II movies or documentaries, you've seen these Stuka attacks and you've heard that very recognizable screaming sound as the plane dove towards its target. That was not a natural sound. These Stukas had sirens built onto the planes to create that sound. Why? Because they understood the terrifying psychological impact on people on the ground when they heard those sirens. The Germans used aircraft in coordinated attacks with tanks to very quickly attack and defeat enemy forces. This was the essence of blitzkrieg. That term is German for lightning war. I don't know if people in other countries realize how the term blitz has become an American term. In American football, a blitz is a defensive strategy where more than the usual number of defensive players rush the quarterback to pressure him and disrupt the passing game. This typically involves 5 or more defensive players rushing the quarterback instead of the standard 3 or 4. I've outlined the advantages of the blitzkrieg tactics. Now let's talk about the other reason why the Germans were so wildly successful in conquering France: battle plan. Supposedly, Napoleon Bonaparte said, "The side that stays within its fortifications is beaten." I often see that quote attributed to him, but I've been unable to find where or when he actually said it or wrote it. There are a lot of quotes like that, where famous people supposedly said something, but we're not sure if they actually wrote or spoke that line. Anyway, people like to use that supposed quote from Napoleon that the French were beaten in 1940 because they were defensive-minded. But there were good reasons why France was so defensive-oriented. By the late 1930s, France could not compete with Germany when it came to important statistics: Number one was population. In 1940, France had somewhere around 40 million people. That was just what was considered metropolitan France, meaning it did not include the French colonies overseas. In contrast, the population of Germany was approximately 70 million, and it was much higher when you included the conquered territories of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. And Germany had a higher birth rate than France, so the disparity was getting bigger every year. Number two, industrial output. By 1940, Germany was outproducing France in military production. These somewhat equal numbers on the Western Front included France's allies of Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Because of the population and war production favoring Germany, the French view was that it was best to remain on the defensive. A long war would favor the Allies, just like it did in World War I. The British did not produce a large army on the continent, but the enormous Royal Navy would eventually starve Germany like it did in the Great War. So employing a defensive strategy was not the main problem, it's how the French deployed their troops. The major poor decision in the French defensive strategy was ignoring the Ardennes. That is a region of thick forests with rough, hilly terrain. The Ardennes covers southeastern Belgium, a good part of Luxembourg, part of northeastern France, and a small part of Germany. The French stationed their weakest army units there. Why? Because of all the hills and the dense forests, along with the limited and fairly primitive roads, the French did not believe that the Germans could send a mechanized army through the Ardennes. And even if a modern army with tanks, artillery, trucks, and other vehicles could physically go through the Ardennes, because of the scarcity of roads, the army would be stretched for many miles or kilometers and subject to aerial attack. So the French thought that the Germans would be foolish to expose the Wehrmacht like that. A lot of the high command in Germany thought the same. That's why they originally rejected the Manstein Plan of sending the panzer divisions through the Ardennes, but Hitler liked the gamble and approved the plan. During the Phony War, the Germans invaded Denmark and Norway on April 9, 1940. Denmark surrendered within a few hours that same day. The King and Crown Prince of Norway departed their country on June 7, 1940, and established a government in exile in London. After the invasions of Denmark and Norway, the Western Allies realized that the invasion of France would be soon. Here is a brief outline of the 6-week campaign that completely changed the balance of power in the world. On May 10, 1940, Army Group B invaded the Low Countries. On that very same day, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Talk about a rough first day at work. In response to the invasion, the British and French forces moved into Belgium to confront the Germans. The Allies did not realize that German Army Group A was going through the Ardennes. Heinz Guderian was leading the panzer divisions at the front of Army Group A. You may be wondering, how is it that this large military force was passing through the Ardennes without being noticed? Well, they were discovered. It's true that the dense forests somewhat camouflaged the panzer divisions, but Allied reconnaissance planes reported large military movements through the Ardennes. Because there were few roads, the panzers, as well as the infantry divisions, were stretched out for many miles or kilometers. Simply put, Army Group A was very vulnerable if attacked from the air. Unfortunately, the French commanders did not believe these reports. They simply did not believe that a large mechanized army could get through the Ardennes region. They believed it when the Germans burst through the Ardennes at the French city of Sedan. The Germans crossed the Meuse River and were now moving quickly across northern France. The Manstein Plan had worked. The British Expeditionary Force, along with a large segment of the French army, were now trapped in Belgium, and now the panzers were south of most of the Allies' armies. The Allies thought that the panzer divisions would now try to take Paris or head north to hit the French and British from the south. In a surprise move, the German tanks drove all the way to the English Channel. On May 20, 1940, the Panzer divisions had reached the English Channel. The infantry followed the German tanks and filled in the areas behind them. This meant that the Germans had cut a line all the way across northern France. The British, Belgian, and Dutch armies, along with a significant amount of the French forces, were now cut off. The Allies were surrounded by the German army on most sides and the English Channel on the remaining side. The Germans now pushed the Allied troops from three sides. The Dutch had already surrendered. They signed the capitulation agreement on May 15, 1940. The Netherlands was conquered within 5 days. I am definitely not making fun of any small country that was unable to stand up to the German war machine. It took the combined efforts of the US, Britain, Canada, and the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis. I'm just pointing out how quickly things were unfolding in May 1940. Belgium surrendered on May 28, 1940. For the British and French forces, it was now a race to the coast to try to escape to Britain. The Germans captured all of the port cities except one, Dunkirk in northern France. This brings us to Operation Dynamo. The British organized an amazing rescue of Allied troops. It wasn't just the Royal Navy that evacuated Allied soldiers from Dunkirk. They also used civilian ships, including fishing boats, yachts, pleasure craft, anything that could make it across the English Channel and back. Between May 26 and June 4, more than 338,000 British, French, and Belgian troops were evacuated from Dunkirk and brought to England to fight another day. This was an incredible achievement by the British, but it was also due to a lot of bravery and sacrifice by mostly French troops who held off the Germans so all of those men could be saved from the continent. Approximately 40,000 of those mostly French soldiers were taken prisoner. Although hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were rescued, practically all of their military equipment was left on the beaches around Dunkirk. It was nice to have all of those men in England ready to oppose the Nazis, but it was tough to lose all of those tanks, artillery pieces, and all other military equipment which had to be abandoned. After the evacuation at Dunkirk, the Germans launched Case Red. That was the German military plan to conquer the remainder of France after Case Yellow. Case Red began on June 5 with Army Group B advancing over the Somme River. Army Group A moved to the rear of the Maginot Line, and Army Group C attacked the front of the Maginot Line, surrounding the French forces in the Maginot Line. On June 10, 1940, Italy declared war on France and Britain. Mussolini wanted to get some of the spoils when France collapsed, but he waited until it was clear that the Germans would be victorious. In essence, the Italians really contributed nothing to the defeat of France. The French government fled to Bordeaux and declared Paris an open city. On June 14, German troops occupied Paris. You've probably seen those videos of the Germans marching past the Arc de Triomphe. If you've seen those images, the video almost always cuts to a French guy in a suit crying. He has become known as the Weeping Frenchman. When you see it, you are led to believe that he's watching the German soldiers marching down the Champs-Élysées. But that's not when or where that video came from. That footage was shot on September 15, 1940, 3 months after Paris fell. The man in the video is Monsieur Jérôme Barzetti, and he was in Marseille on the Mediterranean coast, not Paris. The French were sending their regimental flags, meaning the flags carried by particular military units, to their colony of Algeria rather than let the Germans get their hands on them. The flags were being carried through Marseille to be shipped to Africa. This was an emotional moment, and the cameras caught Monsieur Barzetti crying, but he was not watching the Germans in Paris, and I do not fault him for his tears. After the fall of Paris, the French collapsed. A lot of people wonder how the French could have endured so much in World War I, but gave up in World War II. I think World War I had a lot to do with the French psyche. The British suffered a lot of casualties in World War I, but with few exceptions like some Zeppelin raids over London, their country was not really damaged. And yeah, you heard me, in World War I, Germany used Zeppelins to drop bombs on England. The U.S. was only involved in the last year and a half of the Great War, and certainly there was no damage to American soil. Although I can just hear somebody saying, hey, what about the Black Tom explosion? In case you've never heard of it, on July 30, 1916, German saboteurs blew up the Black Tom Railroad yard in New Jersey along the Hudson River. 4 people were killed, and the enormous explosion damaged buildings in Manhattan and Jersey City and even the Statue of Liberty. By the way, that's the reason why you can go up to the crown of the Statue of Liberty, but not up her arm to the torch. According to the National Park Service, the torch has been closed since the Black Tom explosion of July 30, 1916. And on a personal note, I have climbed to the crown of the Statue of Liberty 11 times. Although those all occurred when I was much younger. Back to the French. Almost all of the fighting on the Western Front of World War I took place in France. You look at photographs from that time, and the French countryside looks more like the surface of the moon because of all of the incredible heavy artillery bombardments. As I told you earlier, 1.385 million Frenchmen died in World War I. That is an insane amount. To put that into perspective, that is in the ballpark of the total number of Americans who have died in every war from the Revolution up to the present time. Practically an entire generation of young Frenchmen were wiped out in World War I. I think the French lost their will to fight because the Germans truly seemed like an irresistible force. 22 years ago, your country gave all it had to stop the Germans from occupying France. Your people suffered greatly, and now, not only are the Germans back, they're even stronger and more menacing than they were the last time. The Prime Minister of France, Paul Reynaud, resigned. He was replaced by Philippe Pétain, who had been a general and was the biggest French hero from World War I. But in 1940, Pétain was 84 years old. Pétain contacted the Germans about a surrender. In November 1918, the Germans signed the armistice with the Western Allies in a railroad car. Hitler ordered that exact railroad car taken out of its museum and placed on the exact spot in the forest of Compiègne where the Germans surrendered to end World War I. Hitler and his entourage met with Pétain and his people on June 22, 1940, in that same railroad car. After the terms of surrender were signed, Hitler had the railroad car taken to Germany as a souvenir of triumph. Although there is some dispute about what was the final fate of that railroad car, it was destroyed during the war. Under the terms of the surrender agreement, the Nazis occupied 3/5 of France. This included the whole northern half of France and the entire coast along the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay. The remaining 2/5 of France in the southeast was theoretically an autonomous country which came to be known as Vichy France. It's called that because of the capital of this rump French state was in the city of Vichy. The government was headed by Philippe Pétain. It was essentially a fascist state, and the Vichy government did whatever Hitler wanted. In November 1942, the Americans, British, and Canadians invaded the French colonies in North Africa. In response, the Germans occupied what had been Vichy France. They now occupied the entire country. Although, to be accurate, the Italians occupied part of southeastern France. Meanwhile, French General Charles de Gaulle had set up a government in exile in England. He was a very prickly character and difficult to deal with, but it was good for France, as well as the Americans and the British, that de Gaulle was set up as a symbol for the Free French. The fall of France completely changed the balance of power throughout the world. Let's look at it from the perspective of various countries. First, how did this affect Germany? Nobody in the German High Command ever imagined such a swift victory. In World War I, France and Germany just pounded on each other for 4 years with hardly any movement or gains. And now, in just 6 weeks, they had defeated their traditional enemy. This meant two things. Number one, it completely solidified Hitler's absolute control over the German people. Most Germans loved Hitler before the war, but they were very apprehensive about a full-scale European war like they had suffered through from 1914 to 1918. But now, they were viewing him as somebody who could do what Kaiser Wilhelm and his army were unable to do. They were viewing Hitler as a miracle worker. This helps explain why the German people followed that lunatic to the bitter end as almost their entire country was destroyed in the latter stages of the war. Number two, the quick defeat of France meant that Hitler could move forward with his deranged plans to conquer Lebensraum in the east. That term Lebensraum means living space. This was always Hitler's ultimate goal, to conquer vast areas in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union for the German people to expand. Of course, that meant enslaving and murdering the local populations. With the quick defeat of France, Hitler tried to make a deal with the British, but fortunately for all of civilization, Winston Churchill refused to even discuss any kind of settlement with the Nazis. As a result, the war between the British Empire and Nazi Germany continued. Remember how I told you that the French signed the surrender document on June 22, 1940? Exactly 1 year later, the German war machine unleashed Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. That was the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was, and still is, the largest invasion in the history of the world. How did the fall of France affect the United Kingdom? Although Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk, was successful, the British were now in a tight spot. But they did have the largest navy in the world and the Royal Air Force. The German High Command thought that the Luftwaffe would just wipe out the Royal Air Force. Once Germany got control of the skies, they could launch Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. So what happened? How did the British defeat the Luftwaffe, which had looked so invincible up to that point? A few factors. Number one, radar. You could thank former Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain for that. Number two, the British fighters were a lot better than people thought. The Spitfires and Hurricanes were great fighter planes, as a lot of German pilots learned the hard way. Number three, they were fighting over their own country. If a British plane was shot down and the pilot was able to get out and parachute down, he could be put back into service. But any German pilots who parachuted out of their planes ended up as prisoners of war. A giant concern for the British was what would happen if Hitler got control of the French fleet. If the Germans captured the French ships and combined them with the fairly large Italian Navy, that could cause a lot of problems for the Royal Navy in Britain. Winston Churchill was determined to avoid this at all costs. On July 3, 1940, French naval vessels that were docked in Britain and Egypt were seized by the British. A large Royal Navy task force sailed to the French anchorage at Mers el Kabir in the French colony of Algeria. This is the ultimatum which was delivered to the French naval commander. It is impossible for us, your comrades up to now, to allow your fine ships to fall into the power of the German or Italian enemy. We are determined to fight on until the end, and if we win, as we think we shall never forget that France was our ally, that our interests are the same as hers, and that our common enemy is Germany. Should we conquer, we solemnly declare that we shall restore the greatness and territory of France. For this purpose, we must make sure that the best ships of the French Navy are not used against us by the common foe. In these circumstances, His Majesty's government have instructed me to demand that the French fleet, now at Mers el Kabir and Oran, shall act in accordance with one of the following alternatives. A. Sail with us and continue the fight until victory against the Germans and Italians. B. Sail with reduced crews under our control to a British port. The reduced crews would be repatriated at the earliest moment. If either of these courses is adopted by you, we will restore your ships to France at the conclusion of the war or pay full compensation if they are damaged meanwhile. C. Alternatively, if you feel bound to stipulate that your ships should not be used against the Germans or Italians unless these break the armistice, then sail them with us with reduced crews to some French port in the West Indies, Martinique for instance, where they can be demilitarized to our satisfaction, or perhaps be entrusted to the United States and remain safe until the end of the war, the crews being repatriated. If you refuse these fair offers, I must, with profound regret, require you to sink your ships within 6 hours. Finally, failing the above, I have the orders from His Majesty's government to use whatever force may be necessary to prevent your ships from falling into German or Italian hands. The French refused to turn over their ships, and the Royal Navy opened fire. After only 10 minutes, the French commander sent this message to the British commander: "All my ships are out of action. I request you cease fire." Other than France, the Soviet Union was probably impacted the most from Germany's quick victory in the West. Joseph Stalin was the dictator in the USSR at that time. At just about any other time in history, he would have been the worst person on the planet, but since he was a contemporary of Adolf Hitler, Stalin had to be satisfied with being the second worst human being alive at that time. Stalin understood the grave threat to his country posed by the Nazis. In his book, Mein Kampf, Hitler outlined his ultimate goal of conquering the Soviet Union to acquire Lebensraum for the German people. So why did Stalin sign that peace treaty with Hitler on August 23, 1939? Well, without suffering many casualties, Stalin got half of Poland, as well as the 3 Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But more important, Stalin was buying time. The Soviet military was a mess at that moment. This was Stalin's fault because he loved purges of anybody he thought was an enemy or might possibly be an enemy in the future. As a result, in the late 1930s, Stalin had killed or imprisoned many of the high officers of the Red Army, leaving the Soviet forces very weak. Stalin needed time to get his armed forces ready and to build the necessary materials for war. In the Great War, the Germans were tied up on the Western Front for 4 years and never broke through. Stalin was certainly hoping that that would be the case this time around. This way, he might avoid an invasion of the Soviet Union. But the sudden collapse of France by mid-June 1940 was a shock to the Soviet dictator. He understood that the Soviet Union might be attacked years before the Red Army would be ready. How did the fall of France affect the United States? After World War I, America became very isolationist. The Navy remained strong, but the Army was reduced to a joke. In 1939, the American Army was supposedly smaller than that of tiny Portugal. Because of the isolationist feelings throughout the country, President Franklin Roosevelt could not do too much to prepare the U.S. military to face the Axis powers. Most in the U.S. government believed that they could rely on the French Army. The French and British would stop Hitler, and the U.S. would not have to worry about it. The fall of France changed the attitudes of many in Congress. They could see that if Britain fell, the Western Hemisphere would be isolated and vulnerable. Congress and the American people were now a lot more willing to prepare militarily. Here are some examples. Number 1, the first peacetime draft in U.S. history was instituted on September 16, 1940, just 3 months after the French surrender. All men between the ages of 21 and 45 had to register for the draft. Number 2, the Two-Ocean Navy Act was enacted on July 19, 1940. This law authorized the U.S. Navy to construct massive fleets for both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. At the time this law was passed, there was great fear that if Hitler defeated Britain, he might get a hold of the Royal Navy, and that could bring the war to American shores. Number 3, build up the Army Air Force. The Air Force was not a separate branch of the military until September 18, 1947. During World War II, it was still part of the U.S. Army. In 1940, President Roosevelt asked American industry to build 50,000 airplanes. FDR also asked for a military budget of $1.2 billion. That would be somewhere around $27 billion in today's money. The U.S. began a production of war materials that had never been seen in history. Number 4, Lend-Lease. On December 17, 1940, President Roosevelt held a press conference where he outlined his proposal, which became known as Lend-Lease. This meant that the U.S. would lend, and I'm certainly putting that in quotes, military weapons and equipment to Britain. Later on, this program would include the Soviet Union and China. Theoretically, the countries receiving these supplies from the United States would return the items or pay for them after the war was over. In reality, that never occurred. Number 5, Roosevelt ran for a third term. When George Washington stepped down from the presidency after 2 terms, he set a precedent. After Washington, no president ran for a third term, although Ulysses S. Grant considered it. Obviously, we can never know for sure, but from everything I've read, it appears that FDR only considered running for re-election in 1940 because of the war. Supposedly, he was undecided until the fall of France. Roosevelt looked at the situation in June 1940, and it was dreary. Hopefully the British would survive, but it was going to be a long fight and they would need our help. And if Britain fell to the Nazis, the US and Canada would be isolated. We don't know what would have happened to Australia and New Zealand, but without the Royal Navy, there was a chance that they might have been conquered by the Japanese. So the fall of France convinced FDR to run for a third term. And he was elected a 4th time in 1944. Fun fact, Roosevelt is the only president to serve more than 2 terms, and he will keep that record because of the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That amendment was ratified on February 27, 1951, and limits presidents to 2 terms in office. So what was the final resolution for France? As many of you know, on June 6, 1944, the Allies, primarily American, British, and Canadian forces, invaded the Normandy region of France. D-Day is very famous, but many people are not aware that on August 15, 1944, in what was called Operation Dragoon, the Allies, including French troops, invaded southern France. Later that month, Paris was liberated by the Allies. The Allies continued to push the Germans out of France, and the Germans finally surrendered in May 1945. Despite the fact that France had been occupied by the Nazis for 4 years, the French were treated as one of the victorious powers at the end of the war in Europe. France was granted one of the 4 occupation zones of Germany as well as Austria. The United Nations was founded on October 24, 1945, after its charter had been ratified by the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, China, and France, along with a majority of other signatories. The UN Security Council is made up of 15 countries. 10 of those countries are elected for 2-year terms by the General Assembly, but 5 of the countries are the permanent members of the Security Council. Each of these nations has a veto which allows any of these 5 countries to block a substantive resolution from being adopted. And who are these 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council? The United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. If you're listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for all the history geeks out there. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.